It was a night I'll never forget. My daughter, Amy, was coming back home after a long assignment. Little did I know we were about to face an encounter that would put our family at risk. As I sat in my living room, waiting for her to arrive, I heard a loud voice outside. Then I froze. The sound of freeze rang out. When I stepped outside to see what was happening, there he was, Curtis Wilson, that HOA security guard, with a gun pointed directly at my daughter's face. My heart stopped. You might think it was some criminal trying to rob us, right? But no. It was Curtis, the very same guard hired to protect us. Why? Because my daughter at 10 p.m. was suspicious returning home. Yes, you heard that right. My daughter, a woman who has led some of the most dangerous counterterrorism operations in the country for the FBI, was considered a threat just for coming home. I am Michael Johnson, a retired diplomatic officer. After years of traveling the world and dealing with international governments, I thought I'd seen everything. But then I moved to Lakeside Pines, a so-called luxury community in Connecticut, where everything quickly spiraled into a nightmare. At Lakeside Pines, the HOA was ruled with an iron fist by Robert Thompson, a former corporate executive with a severe God complex, and his equally arrogant wife, Sarah. Their rules were excessive, from the exact shade of white you could use for your window blinds to what time you could water your lawn. But what really bothered me was Curtis Wilson, the security guard, who'd been kicked off the police force for excessive force. Now he was our neighborhood's self-appointed king. The trouble started the night my daughter came home. Amy, a 26-year-old FBI tactical commander, was returning from a 2-year international assignment. I was ecstatic to see her, but I made one small oversight. I didn't notify security about her arrival. Amy's flight had been delayed, and she finally reached Lakeside Pines at around 10 p.m. I had given her the gate code, but without telling security. No big deal, right? Just a simple mistake, but Curtis Wilson wasn't having it. I opened the door and saw a horrifying sight. Curtis had his gun drawn, aimed directly at Amy. His partner Jason stood behind him, hand on his holster. "Get on the ground now," Curtis shouted. "I'll consider you a threat." Amy stayed calm, her face unreadable. She was the picture of composure trained for these kind of situations. But Curtis, blinded by his ego, wasn't ready for what came next. "Curtis, put that gun down. She's my daughter," I shouted as I rushed forward. But Amy, ever the professional, subtly shifted her stance, ensuring I wasn't in the line of fire. Curtis's response? He didn't lower the weapon immediately. He sneered, "Your daughter should have checked in with security." No exceptions. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he lowered the gun. Amy didn't flinch. She stood her ground. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice controlled. "Pointing a firearm at a federal officer without cause is a felony, and I don't believe you're licensed to carry that weapon in this state." I could see Curtis's face drain of color. But still, his arrogance reared its ugly head. "This is private property. Different rules apply here," he said, his voice wavering. As they walked away, I could hear Jason urgently whispering to Curtis. I had no doubt that the severity of what just happened had sunk in. I closed the door, still shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I said. "This is insane. I can't believe this happened." Amy, ever the reassuring presence, gave me a hug. "It's all right, Dad," she said calmly. "But we need a strategy to deal with this. He's dangerous, not because he's good at his job, but because he's insecure and armed. And that's always a bad combination." As we sat down to catch up, Amy's analytical mind went to work, asking pointed questions about Curtis and the HOA's operations. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes the most dangerous cases aren't the big criminals or the terrorists. Sometimes it's the small-town tyrants that abuse their little kingdoms." I laughed, relieved to have her home. But little did I know those words would turn out to be prophetic. The next day, the HOA's head, Robert Thompson, showed up at our door with a formal letter of warning. He stood there, his silver hair perfectly styled, trying to look concerned while his wife stood behind him, acting like she was ready for a country club brunch rather than a neighborhood showdown. It wasn't over. The battle for justice was just beginning. Stay tuned as I dive into the next chapter of the saga, a saga that saw the arrogant HOA security guard make a deadly mistake by messing with the wrong family. Where are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below. And don't forget to hit that follow button for more updates on this unbelievable story. A manicured hand knocked on the door. "Mr. Johnson," he said, not even bothering to wait for an invitation. "We need to talk about last night's unfortunate incident." His voice oozed with the rehearsed warmth of someone who had taken one too many executive communication courses. "Unfortunate incident," I repeated, my diplomatic training clashing with my burning desire to tell him exactly where to shove that letter. "Your security guard had pointed a loaded weapon at my daughter because she came home late? That's not unfortunate, Robert. That's illegal. Dangerous." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. "Our security team was simply following protocol. Had you properly registered your guest?" I cut him off, something I rarely did. "My daughter is not a guest. She's family. Visiting her home. And no protocol justifies pulling a weapon on an unarmed woman showing ID." Amy appeared beside me, casual but alert. She placed a steadying hand on my arm before calmly addressing Robert. "Mr. Thompson, I understand the need for security protocols, but I'm curious. Are all your security personnel fully licensed to be armed in this state? Because I noticed a few things last night that raised some serious concerns." Her tone was smooth, almost friendly, but I could hear the subtle shift, like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Robert's smile flickered, but he quickly recovered. "All of our staff meet the highest standards, Miss Johnson. Now, if you'll accept this formal warning, we can put this matter behind us." He held out an envelope, but neither of us made a move to take it. "I don't think we'll be accepting that," Amy said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But thanks for stopping by." She closed the door with a soft yet firm click, leaving Robert and Sarah standing there stunned. From the window, I watched them walk away, Sarah's animated gestures already turning this encounter into juicy gossip. Honestly, it was satisfying, but probably not the smartest move. Amy, however, wasn't done. "Oh, I don't know, Dad," she said with a glint of determination in her eyes. "Sometimes you've got to draw a line in the sand before you can start negotiations. And trust me, whether they realize it or not, we're in negotiations now." Later that day, Linda Peterson, 65, sweet as pie, and a former school teacher, came over with a late welcome pie. She apologized for the delay, claiming she had been visiting her grandkids. In casual conversation, Linda revealed a side of the neighborhood we hadn't seen. "Robert and Sarah have run this place like a dictatorship for the last 5 years," she said as we sat on the patio. "Anyone who questions them gets hit with violations or gets shut out of community events. Most people just pay the fines and keep quiet." Amy, ever the listener, asked a few questions that seemed casual, but were really piecing together a bigger picture. Over the next few days, she dug into the HOA bylaws and pointed out several clauses that couldn't hold up in court. Meanwhile, Curtis started parking his security vehicle across from our house for hours on end, an intimidation tactic that might have worked on anyone else. But Amy had stared down actual terrorists. She wasn't fazed. I noticed more subtle changes, too. Neighbors who were once friendly started avoiding us, and Linda reported that Sarah hosted a ladies' tea to which, naturally, I, the only single father in the neighborhood, was not invited. Amy, of course, wasn't distracted. She spent hours on her laptop, making quiet phone calls from her room. When I asked what she was working on, she showed me something that made my stomach churn. Curtis Wilson, it turned out, had been dismissed from the police force after multiple complaints of excessive force. And Robert, he personally intervened to get him hired at Lakeside Pines, despite his record. Worse still, the security company contracted by the HOA was paying Curtis significantly more than the going rate for his position. "Something's off here," Amy murmured, scrolling through public records she had somehow accessed. "The HOA fees in this neighborhood are some of the highest in the state, but the services don't even come close to justifying that." The tension escalated when Amy bumped into Sarah at the grocery store. I wasn't there, but Amy recounted the encounter in detail. Sarah, pretending not to see her, rammed her shopping cart into Amy's. "Oh, it's the FBI agent," Sarah had said loud enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "I hope you're not investigating our little grocery store. We're all law-abiding citizens here, except for those who don't follow the rules." Amy just smiled. "Actually, financial crimes are my specialty. It's amazing what people think they can hide in plain sight." Sarah turned pale and scurried off, but not before a well-dressed woman, clearly intrigued, had overheard the exchange. That woman, it turned out, was Jessica Miller, an attorney who served on the HOA board but had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Robert's leadership. She made her move and approached Amy outside the store, introducing herself with a genuine offer of support. You know, when Jessica suggested we meet for coffee, I didn't expect her to drop a bombshell. There's something wrong at Lakeside Pines, she said, leaning in, her voice low. Financial discrepancies, shady contracts, and rules being enforced selectively. Some of us have been gathering evidence, but we need someone who knows how to handle it. As Amy relayed this to me that evening, I saw that spark in her eyes, the one she used to get when she found a puzzle she couldn't resist. Sometimes, Dad, she said with a grin, you have to let your enemies think they're winning before you flip the script. A week later, the annual HOA meeting arrived, and it was the perfect chance to watch the Thompsons strut their stuff. The community center was set up like a stage for a play, with Robert and Sarah perched to the front, flanked by Curtis and the treasurer, David Clark, an accountant who nodded along to every word Robert spoke like a puppet on strings. We were seated in the back, a move that felt like a petty power play, but one that ended up being a blessing. Amy had the perfect angle to survey the room without raising any suspicion. In the days leading up to the meeting, Amy had made herself a few new friends in the neighborhood, residents who, like Jessica, had quietly grown disillusioned with the current leadership. She'd also rekindled a connection with Officer James Rodriguez from the local police department, an old buddy from the FBI Academy. With her network in place, she was ready. The meeting began predictably. Robert gave a self-congratulatory speech about property values and community standards, while Sarah rolled out plans for social events that, let's be honest, none of us would be invited to. David presented a financial report so vague it could have applied to any community, anywhere. But then the floor opened for questions, and I raised my hand. Drawing on years of diplomatic experience, I asked, I noticed that security expenses have risen by 30% this year, but there's no breakdown. Can we get some clarity on that? The room fell silent. Apparently, detailed questions weren't part of the usual script. Robert's smile tightened, but he quickly recovered. Security is our top priority at Lakeside Pines, Mr. Johnson. The board has reviewed and approved all expenditures. I wasn't letting it go that easily. I understand, but as residents who are paying these increased fees, don't we deserve to know exactly what we're paying for? David shuffled his papers nervously, while Robert's face grew dark. The detailed financials are only available to board members for security reasons, he snapped. But before he could shut it down, Jessica surprised everyone by speaking up. Actually, she said, I'm on the board, and I don't remember seeing any itemized security expenses either. A hush fell over the room, and I could practically feel Robert's anger seething. Curtis, the security guard, moved closer to me, clearly trying to intimidate me. But before things could escalate, the meeting was suddenly wrapped up. As people filed out, Sarah approached Jessica, and the two of them engaged in a heated conversation near the refreshments. Meanwhile, Curtis and another guard positioned themselves by the exit, watching us like hawks. Let them make the next move, Amy whispered as we walked to the car. They're rattled, which means they'll slip up. Sure enough, as we tried to leave the parking lot, a security vehicle blocked our path. Curtis swaggered up to my window, his face dripping with smugness. Sir, your car is in violation of HOA parking regulations. The angle exceeds the permitted 15 degrees from the curb. I almost laughed. It was such a blatant move. But Amy, ever the calm one, placed a hand on my arm and spoke up. Officer Wilson, I think you're mistaken. More importantly, you're blocking the exit, which is a traffic violation. She pulled out her phone, her gaze never leaving Curtis. Officer Rodriguez, she said into the phone. It's Amy Johnson. We're having an issue with security blocking our vehicle and making false claims. Can you send someone over? The change in Curtis's demeanor was immediate. His face drained of color as he realized Amy wasn't just some regular resident. She had real connections. Seems there's been a misunderstanding, he muttered, signaling for the security vehicle to move. As we pulled away, I caught a glimpse of Robert and Sarah watching from the community center steps. Their faces, once filled with arrogance, were now painted with a mix of frustration and something else, uncertainty. That won't win us any neighborhood popularity contest, I said, turning onto our street. Amy's response was calm but firm. We don't need to be liked, Dad. We just need to be respected. And sometimes, respect only comes when you show you're not afraid to stand your ground. Back at home, Amy shared more of her findings. Curtis isn't just a rogue ex-cop with a chip on his shoulder, she said, her voice serious. He's a symptom of something much bigger. I've been digging into the HOA finances with Jessica's help, and there are some serious red flags. For example, the security company supposedly employing Curtis and his team is registered to. Robert's brother-in-law has been charging sky-high rates for services that don't even come close to the price tag. Amy pulled out a thick folder stuffed with financial reports, 5 years' worth of records. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. According to these documents, over $300,000 is unaccounted for funds that were supposedly spent on infrastructure upgrades, but there's no evidence that any actual work was done. I skimmed through the pages, my diplomatic background allowing me to spot the obvious pattern. This isn't just sloppy bookkeeping. It looks like a classic case of embezzlement. I raised an eyebrow, impressed despite the gravity of the situation. But why risk it for such a small sum? Robert doesn't exactly seem like he's struggling financially. Amy's smile was sharp, tinged with a bit of humor. It's not about need, Dad. It's about entitlement. People like Robert and Sarah think the rules are for everyone but them. The money is just the vehicle. The real thrill comes from the power trip. She turned the page, revealing property records. Did you know Robert owns 3 investment properties in this neighborhood under shell companies? Properties that, despite clear violations, never seem to get any citations. As we discussed strategies, Amy's phone buzzed with a text. Board emergency meeting call for tomorrow, she read aloud. R is pushing new bylaw amendments. We need to talk. Her expression turned determined. They're speeding up their timeline, which means we need to speed up ours. It's time to bring in some expert help. She made a call, her voice brisk and businesslike. Marcus, it's Amy. I need your expertise on a financial analysis. Civilian matter, but urgent. Can you come to Connecticut tomorrow? She nodded, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. Perfect. I'll send the address. When she hung up, she explained that Marcus Reed was one of the FBI's top financial crime specialists. He owed her a favor and would help verify the discrepancies in these records, building a case that would be rock solid. I raised an eyebrow. A case? Amy, this is a neighborhood spat, not a federal case. Her expression turned serious as she replied, Dad, when people in power misuse that power and commit financial crimes in the process, it's exactly the kind of thing that deserves investigation. And besides, she smirked, no one points a gun at me and gets away with it. The Thompsons' response was swift and entirely predictable. The very next morning, we received 5 HOA violation notices, each more ridiculous than the last. Our trash can was allegedly half an inch out of position. The light bulb in our porch fixture was too warm in tone. Apparently, the American flag I had proudly hung was improperly illuminated after dark. The absurdity didn't stop there. Curtis, or one of his lackeys, would park outside our house for hours, snapping photos of alleged infractions. When I tried to use the community pool, I was told my membership had been suspended pending review of outstanding violations. Several neighbors who had once greeted us with friendly waves now crossed the street to avoid us, clearly warned to steer clear of the Johnsons. Through all this, Amy remained remarkably unflappable, even amused. Classic intimidation tactics she observed as we sifted through the latest stack of mail, which included 2 more violation notices. They're trying to make us uncomfortable enough to either cave or leave. Unfortunately for them, they've picked the wrong targets. Instead of feeling intimidated, I found myself growing more determined with every petty attack. Over my career, I've faced down dictators and brokered peace deals in the middle of active conflict zones. Robert Thompson's suburban reign of terror? Amateur hour by comparison. Then Marcus Reed arrived as promised, a no-nonsense, detail-oriented financial expert with the instincts of an investigator. For 2 days, he pored over the financial documents Jessica had given us, occasionally letting out a low whistle at the more blatant discrepancies. If these records are accurate, he said, scanning through a stack of papers at our dining room table, you've got multiple violations of financial regulations here. The security contract alone is textbook self-dealing. And this pattern of so-called infrastructure improvements with no actual work being done, that's a red flag. Embezzlement, Amy muttered under her breath as she surveyed the situation. Meanwhile, she had quietly installed a series of nearly invisible security cameras around our property. Not the flashy kind that would raise eyebrows, but discreet ones that captured everything, even the things that slipped under the radar. It's just for documentation, she said when I raised a questioning brow. Building a case needs evidence. Her foresight paid off when, just 3 days after the HOA meeting, the cameras caught something shocking. It was 3 a.m., and there were Curtis and 2 other security guards snooping around our yard, flashlights in hand, measuring grass height and taking photographs. The audacity was staggering. Then came Linda Peterson. She showed up at our door, tears streaming down her face. Sarah Thompson, she cornered me at the community center. Linda stammered, voice trembling. She said she'd have my grandkids banned from visiting if I stayed friends with you. My heart broke for her. I'm so sorry, she kept repeating. But my grandkids are all I have left. I can't risk losing them. Amy, surprisingly gentle in the face of this cruelty, placed a hand on Linda's shoulder. You don't owe anyone an apology, Linda, she said softly. People like Sarah Thompson prey on the weak, but don't worry. They won't be in power for long. That night, things took an even more bizarre turn. From our living room, we saw something unsettling. At the Thompson house, lights flickered and soon David Clark showed up, carrying file folders. 30 minutes later, Curtis arrived. They all gathered in the dimly lit house, arguing heatedly. It was clear they were in damage control mode. They're rattled, Amy said, watching the whole scene unfold. Jessica's questions at the meeting really shook them. They're scrambling now, trying to cover their tracks. She grabbed her phone, sending quick, purposeful texts. Then, with determination in her eyes, she turned to me. It's time to escalate. The very next morning, Curtis showed up at our door with 2 guards in tow, looking smug. He tried to push past me with a false sense of authority. We're conducting a mandatory security inspection, he declared, as if he had any right to just waltz in. I stood firm, blocking the doorway. No permission, no entry, I said, trying to keep my anger in check. You're not coming in without a warrant. Curtis held up a piece of paper like it was a golden ticket. According to HOA Bylaws Section 12, Paragraph 3, he said, his smirk widening, security can inspect properties if there's reasonable suspicion of a violation. We've noted 27 violations this past week alone. Amy stepped forward, her phone out, clearly recording the confrontation. That clause directly contradicts state law regarding private property rights, she replied calmly. And as for documentation, would you care to explain why you and your guards were in our yard at 3 a.m. 2 nights ago? Curtis faltered, momentarily losing his bravado. But then his face hardened with hostility. You're interfering with HOA security operations, he sneered. There will be consequences. As they walked away, one of the guards glanced over his shoulder, unease written all over his face. It was obvious they were starting to crack under the pressure. That night, our cameras caught them again. This time, the situation went beyond petty harassment. They returned after midnight, deliberately vandalizing our garden, tearing out plants and spray painting a crude message on our fence. I was furious, ready to march over there and confront them head-on. But Amy stopped me. She placed a hand on my arm, her voice calm but her eyes alight with purpose. This is exactly what we need, she said. They're making mistakes. Each one strengthens our case. She made a phone call, her tone all business now. It's time, she said simply. We need to bring in reinforcements. The weekend arrived with a surprising twist. A group of neighbors showed up on our lawn, tools in hand, ready to help restore the damage to our garden. Jessica Miller had organized it, rallying others who had faced similar mistreatment but had been too intimidated to speak out until now. As they worked, stories began to spill out. Selective rule enforcement, unjust fines, social shunning. Sarah Thompson had orchestrated it all to keep control. But as each person shared their experience, something remarkable happened. A quiet, unspoken resolve began to take hold. This wasn't just about a garden anymore. This was about reclaiming power. Among the volunteers was Marcus Reed, who introduced himself simply as Amy's colleague, though he didn't mention his FBI credentials. His timing couldn't have been better. Curtis drove by slowly, clearly taking note of who was associating with us. His eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of our growing group. Is that the security guard you mentioned? Marcus asked, his voice low, his trained eyes taking in Curtis's posture and the telltale bulge under his jacket. Amy nodded, and Marcus excused himself to make a quick call. 20 minutes later, we knew we were no longer facing this fight alone. Away from prying ears, James finally revealed what he had uncovered about Curtis Wilson. His file? A total disaster. Multiple complaints of excessive force, 2 questionable shootings that were ruled justified, and a domestic violence call that somehow disappeared from the records. Curtis had been quietly pushed out of the department with nothing but a neutral recommendation, which led him straight to where he was now. James hesitated for a moment before delivering the kicker. There's more. Curtis doesn't even have a valid license to carry a concealed weapon as a private security officer. The one he showed you expired last year and wasn't renewed because of serious concerns over his psychological evaluation. As Amy, Marcus, Jessica, and James huddled inside, building their case against the Thompson regime, the real work was unfolding right in front of us. The public display outside, our growing coalition, was only the surface. Inside, things were getting much deeper. Jessica had been secretly siphoning HOA financial records for months, revealing alarming discrepancies between reported expenditures and the actual services. Marcus had followed a trail of shell companies that connected Robert Thompson to vendors, each receiving inflated contracts. And James? He'd uncovered police reports exposing a disturbing pattern of selective law enforcement, where Curtis was issuing tickets to Thompson's critics, while violations from his allies were conveniently ignored. Pointing to a detailed flowchart on the dining table, Marcus explained, the security company Curtis works for, it's registered to Sarah's brother. It operates from a virtual office and only has one client, Lakeside Pines. They've been pulling in over $150,000 a year for the past 3 years, but tax records show they only pay out $60,000 in wages. The rest vanishes into offshore accounts. Jessica, grim-faced, nodded in agreement. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Take the landscaping contract, the road maintenance, even the community center renovations. It's all the same. Companies connected to Robert receive inflated contracts, do the bare minimum, and pocket the difference. It all disappears. As the evening wound down, our allies left with a sense of purpose. The garden was restored, and our coalition was stronger than ever. But Linda, who had been quieter than most, stayed behind. I've been thinking about what you said, Amy, she said, her voice firmer than I'd ever heard it. They can't ban my grandchildren from visiting. It's not even in the bylaws. I've let fear control me long enough. I'm done with it. Amy smiled, her warmth undeniable. Exactly, Linda. Their power only exists because people believe in it. Once that belief starts to crack, everything changes. She didn't finish the thought, but we all understood the gravity of what she was saying. The Thompson regime wasn't built on real power. It was held together by fear and the illusion of authority. And that illusion was starting to break down. The very next day, we had an unexpected visit. Robert and Sarah Thompson showed up at our door, their smiles as fake as ever. Robert spoke first, his tone forced and condescending. Michael, we feel like this situation has gotten out of hand, he began. We'd like to propose a resolution. He handed me a document titled Mutual Non-Disclosure and Non-Litigation Agreement. Sarah chimed in, her enthusiasm as fake as her smile. We're all neighbors, after all. There's no reason for things to get unpleasant, right? I let them in with all the politeness I could muster, noting how Sarah's eyes darted around the room, clearly on the lookout for anything that could be reported as a violation. Amy, ever the professional, read through the document with sharp precision, raising an eyebrow at some of the more bold clauses. This is interesting, she said, breaking the silence. Essentially, you're offering to stop issuing violation notices if we agree to never question the HOA's financial decisions or bring any legal action against the association or its officers. She put the document down, her expression neutral. May I ask what's behind this sudden desire for reconciliation? Robert shifted, clearly uncomfortable. As Sarah said, we're all neighbors. The community functions best when everyone works together harmoniously. Harmoniously under your control, you mean? I interjected, catching a sharp look from Amy, who was clearly playing the long game here. Sarah's forced smile quickly turned into a thin line. We've been patient with your adjustment period, Mr. Johnson. Not everyone is cut out for community living. Amy smoothly interrupted, her tone calm but firm. What my father means is that harmony requires transparency and fairness. And this agreement offers neither. She handed the document back to Robert, her point made. As I handed Robert the document, I could see his polite mask crack for a brief second, just enough to expose the simmering anger beneath. You're making a serious mistake, he hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. There are consequences for defying the HOA leadership. But before he could storm out, Amy, ever the strategist, casually called after them, a mischievous glint in her eyes. Oh, and Robert, just so you know, this conversation's been recorded. Threatening homeowners for standing up for their rights? That could be considered harassment under state law. The doors slammed behind them, but not before I caught a glimpse of their stunned faces. I turned to Amy, feeling a surge of respect for her. What's our next move? I asked, genuinely curious. She smiled, a confident and slightly devilish grin. A press conference, Dad. With your diplomatic experience and that natural charisma of yours, you'll be the perfect spokesperson. The emergency HOA meeting Robert had orchestrated? It was supposed to ram through new bylaws that would tighten his grip on power and push out anyone who didn't fit his vision. But Amy had played her cards with military precision. Officer Rodriguez, Agent Marcus Reed, and even a local reporter were scattered around a room, ready for the show. The community center buzzed with tension, like the calm before a storm. Robert was sitting at the front, flanked by Sarah, David, and Curtis. Their faces? A mix of determination and barely contained anxiety. Little did they know their game was up. Robert began with his usual spiel, smooth and confident, though you could tell the cracks were starting to show. Before we get into the new bylaws, I want to remind everyone of the importance of community unity. Lakeside Pines has always prided itself on exceptional standards, which benefit everyone's property values. Unfortunately, some newer residents have become resistant to these standards, causing unnecessary division. His eyes locked on me, his words thinly veiled, but I just smiled back. Years of diplomatic poker faces were paying off. When he finally got to the part about the First Amendment, which would give security personnel carte blanche access to all properties, I stood up. Point of order, I said, cutting through the tension in the room. Robert reluctantly acknowledged me. I believe before we vote on giving the board more power, the residents deserve to be fully informed about how the current powers have been used. There was a ripple of murmurs as I strode confidently to the front, placing a folder on the table. As a concerned resident, I continued, I've reviewed the HOA's financial records. These documents should be available to all members, but for some reason, they've been nearly impossible to access. Robert tried to interrupt, but Jessica, who had been silently backing us all along, quickly seconded my right to speak, citing the very bylaws Robert had used to silence others. The room was now fully engaged, watching intently as I laid out the truth. Over the next 30 minutes, I took them on a tour of what I could only call financial malfeasance. I started with the security company, the one siphoning off $150,000 of our HOA fees every year. It was owned by Sarah Thompson's brother, who was also employing guards, like Mr. Wilson, without proper licensing. I could see Curtis squirming in his seat as all eyes turned to him. And then there's the landscaping contract, I continued, awarded to Robert's former college roommate at a price 60% above the market rate, with little to show for it. Jessica was busy distributing packets, financial documents, email threads, photographs, laying bare the systematic abuse happening behind closed doors. Robert's face was now a mask of pure rage, while Sarah leaned in, whispering furiously to David, who looked like he might faint at any moment. But I wasn't done. Perhaps the most troubling, I said, voice low and deliberate, is the $300,000 collected for infrastructure improvements over the past 3 years. But there's no record of any actual work being done. Where did that money go? The room went quiet. Curtis stood up, his body language aggressive, but before he could take a step toward me, Officer Rodriguez smoothly intercepted him. They spoke quietly, but it was clear Curtis wasn't going to get away with it this time. Robert slammed his hands on the table, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. These accusations are baseless, completely unfounded, he sputtered. But the damage was already done. The truth was out. The meeting had taken an unexpected turn, and there was no going back. The meeting had barely started before it was abruptly halted. Robert Thompson's attempt to shut down the conversation exploded in his face as residents rose in a unified outcry, demanding answers to the very questions I had raised. The financial records speak for themselves, I said, my voice steady and calm, despite the tension. If there are reasonable explanations for these discrepancies, now's the time to hear them. Things quickly spiraled out of control for the Thompson administration when David, his face drained of color, nervously blurted, I just processed the paperwork Robert gave me. I didn't know about the shell companies. Sarah gasped, horrified by his confession, while Robert attempted to physically drag him away from the microphone. The reporter was scribbling frantically in his notebook, and Marcus Reed had already positioned himself near the exit, sensing the imminent chaos. Robert, realizing his grip on the situation was slipping, switched tactics. This is a private HOA matter, blown way out of proportion. Mr. Johnson clearly has a personal vendetta, especially after his daughter was questioned by security. At that, Amy, who had stayed quiet, blending into the background, finally stepped forward. Her face was the picture of professionalism, but the intensity in her eyes was unmistakable. I believe the residents should see exactly what constitutes appropriate questioning in Lakeside Pines. With a swift motion, she connected her phone to the projector, and the room was suddenly filled with security camera footage. We watched in stunned silence as Curtis pointed a gun at Amy's face, followed by footage of him and his team vandalizing our property under the cover of darkness. The room gasped collectively, and Sarah's horrified moan cut through the air. What happened next occurred so quickly, many residents later admitted they couldn't fully process it. Curtis, unable to control himself in the face of his public exposure, lunged toward me with a roar of fury. His hand moved toward his concealed weapon, and several people screamed in alarm. Before anyone could react, Amy's movements were a blur, fluid, calculated, and executed with such precision that it looked effortless. One moment, Curtis was charging with murderous intent. The next, he was face down on the floor, his own handcuffs securing his wrists behind his back. Amy's knee pressed firmly between his shoulder blades. Officer Rodriguez quickly took control, arresting Curtis for assault, illegal possession of a concealed weapon, and making criminal threats. As Curtis was led away, still hurling insults, Robert made a break for the exit, only to find Marcus Reed waiting for him, badge in hand. "Robert Thompson," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Reed with the FBI. I have a few questions about the financial discrepancies in the Lakeside Pines HOA accounts, particularly regarding the offshore transfers from allegedly legitimate vendor payments." As Robert was escorted out for questioning, the room fell into stunned silence. Moments later, it erupted into chaotic discussions as the community tried to process the whirlwind of events. Jessica, quick on her feet, took charge, using her legal expertise to calm the crowd and establish an interim leadership committee to manage HOA affairs until proper elections could be held. Sarah Thompson, abandoned by her husband and facing the unraveling of her social status, fled the room in tears. David, torn between fear and relief, voluntarily handed over all the financial records to Officer Rodriguez, seemingly hoping for leniency. When the dust settled and the last of the residents trickled out, Amy and I made our way home through the warm evening air. We were quiet at first, but a strange sense of peace settled over us. The truth had come to light, and the community had taken its first step toward healing. After everything that went down, I couldn't help but wonder, was all of this really necessary? I asked her, genuinely curious about her approach. Why not just report Curtis that first night for pulling a weapon and be done with it? Amy paused, her gaze thoughtful as she considered the question. "We could have done that, sure," she replied. "But that would have only fixed a symptom, not the root of the problem. What was happening at Lakeside Pines wasn't about one rogue security guard. It was about a deeper, systemic abuse of power that affected everyone. Bigger picture stuff." She offered a slight, knowing smile. "A bad guard is a matter for the police. A coordinated effort to defraud homeowners, using intimidation tactics to silence anyone who stands up, that's worth taking down properly." As we approached our house, a reporter who'd followed us since the meeting called out, eager for a statement. "Who exactly are you, Ms. Johnson?" she asked, notebook at the ready. Amy didn't hesitate. She smiled and with an air of quiet authority replied, "Just a homeowner who knows her rights." And with that, she guided me inside, quietly closing the door on the latest chapter of what was quickly becoming the Lakeside Pines saga. 3 months later, the ripple effects of those actions were everywhere. Investigations unfolded with surgical precision. Robert faced a slew of charges for embezzlement, fraud, and financial misconduct, while Curtis had his own set of charges to deal with: illegal weapons possession, assault, property damage, and harassment. The story spread from local papers to national outlets, dragging the former leadership into the spotlight, but ultimately shining a much-needed light on the corruption that had festered in the community. As for Sarah Thompson, her former position of power crumbled under the weight of mounting legal bills and her damaged reputation. She quietly listed her house and moved in with her sister, leaving behind the life she once dominated. David Clark, the treasurer who had enabled the financial fraud, became a key witness for the prosecution, spilling all the details of Robert's manipulation of HOA funds over the years in exchange for a more lenient sentence. The security company was disbanded, and a new, properly licensed firm was brought in to restore order and authority. But perhaps the most profound change came from within the community itself. Jessica Miller, along with Linda Peterson, was elected as the new HOA president and vice president. Their first actions included revising the bylaws to ensure transparency, establishing fair enforcement procedures, and slashing the absurd fees that had once lined the pockets of the previous regime. The transformation didn't stop there. Community events that were once exclusive affairs became genuinely inclusive, and neighbors who had never spoken to each other before now greeted one another in passing, whether they were walking their dogs or collecting mail. It was the change that everyone had hoped for, but never believed could happen. One evening, as Amy and I sat together on the porch, enjoying the peaceful sunset before she left for her next assignment, an unexpected visitor arrived at our gate. It was Sarah Thompson, and she looked different. Her usual designer clothes replaced by simple jeans, her perfectly manicured appearance now showing signs of strain. "I need to talk to you," she said hesitantly, standing just inside the gate. I exchanged a glance with Amy, who nodded. I invited Sarah in, but she chose to remain standing, her discomfort palpable. After a long pause, she spoke. I wanted to apologize before I leave," she said quietly. "I knew about some of what Robert was doing. Not everything, but enough that I should have said something. I convinced myself it wasn't hurting anyone, that it was just the way things worked." Amy's voice was calm, but firm. "Why did you stay silent, Sarah? You had to have known it was wrong." Sarah's composure wavered, and her eyes began to fill with emotion. "You don't understand. My entire identity was wrapped up in being Mrs. Robert Thompson, the Queen of Lakeside Pines. Before I met him, I was just a receptionist in a small town. The status, the power, the envy of other women. I became addicted to it." She looked down at her hands, no longer adorned with rings, her nails unpolished. "Now I'm starting over at 55 with nothing but alimony and a mountain of regrets." In that moment, I felt a surprising sympathy for her. I understood, perhaps more than I cared to admit, the human need to feel significant, to be seen and valued. And that hunger for recognition had led her down a path that, in the end, left her with nothing. After Sarah left, Amy and I decided to host a spontaneous barbecue, inviting the neighbors who had supported us and others who were simply eager to be part of the fresh start we were building. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the evening grew warmer, Jessica approached me. "Your daughter is remarkable," she said, nodding toward Amy, who was chatting with a group of residents. "I've learned more about leadership from watching her these past few months than in my entire career. She never sought credit or control, just justice and order. The community will miss her." I felt a familiar swell of pride. Amy's ability to lead, without seeking the spotlight, had always astounded me. But it also made me wistful, knowing that her extraordinary talents often meant she was called away, leaving behind a void that only she could fill. Later that evening, as the last of the guests departed and the house fell quiet, Amy and I sat on the porch steps, glasses of bourbon in hand, savoring our final evening together before her early morning flight. "I've been thinking," I said, my words loosening with the warmth of the liquor. "You could have dealt with Curtis that first night and been done with it. But instead, you orchestrated this whole transformation. Why?" Amy considered her glass thoughtfully before responding, her voice quiet but sure. "Growing up watching you work, I learned something important. True diplomacy isn't about avoiding conflict. It's about fixing what's broken, really fixing it. Curtis aiming a gun at me wasn't the root of the problem. It was merely a symptom of a deeper, more toxic system. Taking him down alone wouldn't solve anything." As I stood there, watching Amy, she looked out over the quiet neighborhood, where the soft glow of porch lights flickered like tiny stars. "This isn't about revenge, Dad," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about restoration. Communities should be places of trust, not fear." In that moment, it clicked. It wasn't just her tactical brilliance that had kicked in when danger struck. It was her deep desire to rebuild, to restore what had been lost. A skill I hadn't truly recognized before. "I've spent most of my life neutralizing threats," she continued, her voice steady. "But there's something incredibly fulfilling about creating something better in the aftermath." The next morning, as I was about to take Amy to the airport, we received a pile of thank you cards from neighbors. Many of them were people we barely knew just a few months ago. Do you think you'll be okay here without me? Amy asked, a little concern in her voice as we loaded her luggage. What if some other security guard tries to overstep? I couldn't help but laugh, feeling more settled in Lakeside Pines than I ever had. I think I'll manage. Your old man still has a few tricks up his sleeve. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the house, no longer a place of tension, but a true home. Beyond it, the neighborhood had found its voice. You know, Amy said as the airport loomed in the distance, I've got a philosophy I've developed over the years. Sometimes you don't need to pull the trigger to win a battle. Sometimes understanding your opponent's game and using it against them is the greatest victory. She smiled at me, her face bathed in the golden glow of the rising sun. And sometimes the communities that seem the most peaceful have fought the hardest battles. Since that night, when any HOA in Lakeside Pines, or anywhere for that matter, tries to overstep its authority, people often recall the story of the FBI commander's daughter and her diplomatic father. It's a reminder that not all heroes wear capes. Some heroes simply know their rights and stand their ground. And the most important lesson? Never point a gun at someone without knowing who they are. Especially when that someone is an FBI tactical commander with a sharp mind for strategy and an unwavering sense of justice.